And I yield back.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for sticking with us till the bitter end. I also appreciate your service. As I was doing the math in my head, Mr. Foster, what's that, a combined 70 years, more than 70 years between the two of you. I want to call on some of that experience because I go back to the letter that you sent, Mr. Goss, to Secretary Geithner last fall that said the level of the trust funds would be unaffected by payroll tax holiday legislation. I certainly defer to your actuarial expertise. I'm worried about the integrity of the trust funds. In your 70-plus years of collective experience, is it your testimony that funding sources that come out of general revenues are equally secure as funding sources that come out of trust fund deposits? Or have you seen over your years of service differences in the stability of those two revenue streams, Mr. Goss?
Well, certainly we've seen that there seems to be an absolute sense that money once in the trust funds, putting aside arguments about economic impact and meaningfulness of trust funds, once money is in the trust funds, that does represent a liability on the general fund of the Treasury, and that money will be produced and will be provided to that program.
So a distinction without a difference, then, that it's coming from the general revenues instead of out of payroll taxes?
Well, once the money has been generated in a given year and put into the trust funds, it's not easy, it's not really probably possible to determine how much of that money came from taxes in the past, from general revenue contributions in the past, from interest in the past. The money is just there and it is owed. On an ongoing basis in the future, though, I believe perhaps your distinction is there has always been the concept for Social Security as the earned right to benefits. And having payroll taxes on people's individual earnings provides the sense of the earned right, which gives the American people the strong hold that they have on the fact that the Social Security is owed. If there were a very long sustained period of time in which, for reasons other than just temporary fiscal stimulus, we were to have a substantial portion of the program paid for rather than by payroll taxes, instead by general fund, then people would undoubtedly begin to view the program somewhat differently.
It was just 1 year, now it's 2 years. We're heading down that road towards a long period of time. What about you, Mr. Foster? Do you feel that same sense that payments into trust funds from individuals give a sense of ownership that transfers from general revenues do not?
I think that's correct. I'd agree with what Steve said just now. As a practical matter, over the years, we've seen that in a budgetary context, as opposed to a trust fund context, that the payroll tax revenues for both Social Security and hospital insurance, Part A of Medicare, are sort of off limits. It's a dedicated source of revenue. It's sort of, nobody's talking about, hey, let's take a portion of these payroll taxes and use them for some other purpose. That just isn't considered. Whereas for the general revenues, you all have to fight and worry about that every day that you're here, pretty much because of all the competing requirements.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's what one of our Social Security trustees, Dr. Charles Blahouse, was talking about. I want to quote him directly because I don't want to misstate his point. He says, Social Security was not established to be a source of temporary stimulus funds. The idea that its payroll tax rate should be moved up and down with economic events is highly dangerous to the program's financial future. I mean, folks have been citing the letter that you wrote, Mr. Goss, to say that the trust fund levels would be unaffected. That's true, but the integrity of the program, at least so says one of your trustees, is highly affected. As a fellow who came here to solve problems rather than point fingers of blame, I'm actually struck by the fact that you refer to this major piece of legislation dealing with Social Security and its trust fund as leaving the trust fund levels unaffected. Because I would tell you that's a failure. That we have all sat here around the table all morning talking about the challenges that are facing us. We pass a major piece of legislation that does not one thing to solve the problem. Are you familiar with my freshman colleague Jeff Landry's SPICE Act? It's H.R. 3551 that would have said, if we need this holiday for stimulus, let's do it, but let's establish personal choice on the backside that you'll delay your personal receipt so that you can collect your trust fund rebate today, as it were. My understanding is that bill would have actually affected trust fund levels by reducing liability some $2 trillion over the three-generational window. Can you speak briefly to that, Mr. Goss?
That's correct. Mr. Landry's proposal, and I believe he has some co-sponsors, would make voluntary on a permanent basis the 2% payroll tax reduction that workers could choose to have. And in any 1 year in which a person chose to take that, they would have their normal retirement age, their basic retirement age for benefits, increased by 1 month. If they did it for 10 years, their basic retirement age would increase by 10 months. That change in the retirement age for the people who chose this option would accrue to a positive, to improving the financial status of Social Security, but most particularly that would occur because the cost of the reduced payroll taxes would be reimbursed from the general fund of the Treasury on an ongoing basis in the future, as it has been for 2011 and 2012.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
both.
Mr. McClintock.
To follow up on that point, then, by linking the costs with the benefits, we'd be giving every American family the choice of whether the year's worth of tax relief is worth the actual cost of that to the system, 1 month delay in retiring, and they could make that every year depending upon their own circumstances, desires, wishes, and needs. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. In fact, we calculated in working with Mr. Landry and his staff, the 1 month for each year as being approximately an average neutral effect for the trust funds. If you keep 2% of your payroll taxes in 1 year and have your normal retirement age go up by 1 month, the trust funds over the very long haul would be about neutral. But the trust funds actually turn out to be better because the cost of the tax reduction then is reimbursed by the
So
general fund.
we're reducing the payroll taxes coming into the system, but at the same time we're reducing the obligations of the system going out. Now, when we don't do that, we end up, as you've pointed out now in response to questions from Mr. Van Hall and Mr. Stutzman and Mr. Woodall, we end up reimbursing the Social Security Fund from the General Treasury. The General Treasury, of course, has basically one source of income. That's the taxpayers. Is that correct? Either through their current taxes or to the extent that government has to borrow through their future taxes. But one way or another, it comes out of their taxes. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. That was true in the 2011 and 12, but that is also true for the tax reductions.
So would it be
Mr. Landry
fair to
explained.
say that cutting the payroll tax without reducing the obligations that the payroll tax pays for is simply playing a shell game over which taxes are going to pay for those obligations?
I certainly wouldn't use the word shell game, but I think there's no question that if indeed the intent of the reduced payroll taxes was simply to put more dollars in people's hands
Yeah.
as a stimulus measure, the payroll tax undoubtedly was utilized just because it was a readily available method.
Certainly, general taxes will have to make up for the difference either now or in the future. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
I would call that a shell game. Mr. Foster, I want to know a little bit more about the IPAB. How would you compare that with the UK's National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence? I believe that the smarmy acronym is NICE.
There are potentially some similarities with the NICE group in the UK. Much of what they're doing is what we refer to as comparative effectiveness. And that's been a controversial topic. I'm sorry that's the case because I think there actually is potential there.
The IPAB has that same authority?
Somewhat. The IPAB can look into different approaches. They don't have to just reduce provider payment rates.
Can they say we'll provide this service but not that, we'll provide this service but only under certain circumstances?
They can't fundamentally change the benefit structure and the coverage for Medicare. It's a little bit of a gray area. Could they get into issues of this new procedure that is now available and which costs 10 times as much as the old procedure,
Well,
but isn't really any more effective?
For example, in the UK, there's a drug, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, called ipilimumab. Essentially, it doubles the 1 and 2 year survival rates for malignant melanoma. NICE said at £80,000 per year, that's just too expensive. Could the IPAB issue a similar decree?
That I don't know. I think the intention is not to do that.
Or the intention, but do they have the authority?
Not having studied the law carefully enough for that point or that question, I'll give you an answer later on. I think the intention is that they not do that kind of thing.
Well, again, the intention and the authority are two different things.
Potentially, that's
I'm
right.
sure they intend only good. NICE intends only good. But through that single decree, that's just too expensive a new procedure, and you just said that the IPAB has the authority to say it's a new procedure, it's too expensive, we just don't want to deal with it. That's been called a death sentence for those with malignant melanoma, particularly those of younger age in the UK.
Well, and that's why I believe that the IPAB does not have that authority. The analysis and the support for comparative effectiveness under the Affordable Care Act is also very limited because of concerns of that type.
Well, NICE has also said with respect to Lucentis, which is a drug that's been cited for an unprecedented ability to reverse macular degeneration, NICE said, well, that's pretty expensive. We'll allow the treatment, but only after the patient's already lost sight in one eye. Is that something conceivably the IPAB could decree?
I don't think so.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you for coming again. Thank you for spending your time. This has been very enlightening. This hearing's adjourned.